Hello lovelies, welcome to Amy of Melbourne. My name's Amy, obviously, and today I'm going to be taking you through a tutorial of how to make my pattern, the Skadi quilted vest. This is for view B, which is a bib front side closure version of the vest. There's already a tutorial for view A, so if you want to see that, check for the link in the description below. We're going to start our patchwork with the front, which is this pentagram. You get all of the pattern pieces in the add-ons download on my website for the Skadi vest. Once you have cut out your paper templates, then it's time to start actually cutting out your fabric. Make sure that you iron this, unlike me, and we're going to actually cut it out really roughly first, and then we're going to correct the shape so that it's actually a pentagon. The pentagon is the basics of our pentagram. You don't have to use it, but I find it really lovely as a centerpiece. Once it's rough cut, then you can use a ruler or something with a hard edge so that you can take your rotary cutter and actually cut out the shape properly. I'm going to be using one of these rotating mats. It makes it a lot easier when cutting out all these small shapes. We're going to do the same thing for all of the other shapes, but now I'm actually going to double up my fabric to make this a much quicker process. You only need one pentagon, but for all the other shapes, you do need multiples. These shapes have actually changed slightly for the download, so yours look a little different. Don't stress about it. It's just because this was my first mock-up and I have since made it much better than what I used. Now we have the center of our star and our star's points. We now need to fill out the other sections so that we end up with a square or a rectangle. That's for the most part what quilting is. So we're going to add in these little partial circle pieces to fill in the spaces between the points. And then after we've done those, then we're going to create these, which are basically a drunkard's path that goes around the pentagram thing altogether so that it makes it into a square. And there we have it, our square, our partial circles, our points, and our final pentagon in the center. Once our pentagram block is sewn, which is the next step, we're going to add strips to it to make sure it's big enough for our pattern pieces.
I've never done this shape on the machine before. My instinct is to just paper piece it, but I want to conquer it. So what I think is that I'll do the top is a separate piece. Those together. That, and then this. I hope that makes sense, and then it makes straight lines, and this works.
So all of your patchwork together using 1/4 inch seam allowance.
So I think I lined these ones up right. They should have been at the bottom, but oh well, it is what it is. But anyway, so now this one goes onto this one, and then this one, and then this one's last. Yep, I have to undo these, so you got to make sure that your triangles are in line with your part circles. Okay, so now that this is done, it's time to add these things around.
This outside square ring section is sewn together like a drunkard's path, except that you don't have the central circle as 4 sections. So you need to pre-sew the seam allowance where they connect on those little short ends together before you start sewing around the outside. You can also do this as you're sewing if you leave them unstitched, just those ends, before you add in the other pieces. Now that our pentagram block is stitched, we need to make sure that it is actually a square, and mine definitely wasn't one. It stretched out in a lot of different ways. That is one of the hardest parts of doing a drunkard's path, is that it will stretch a little bit. So you just need to go around and use the seams where the drunkard paths have joined up to make sure that you're making this all straight and square to itself. We now need to build out our block so that we have enough fabric for our actual garment pieces. So I'm going to do this by just adding lots of different strips and stripes all the way around my blocks until I'm happy with it, and then I'm going to true it up again. Periodically, I'm going to take my pattern pieces and put them over the top so that I can check that I actually am going in the right direction and adding more fabric on where I need it to be. For this version, I'm doing view B, so it's actually on the fold at the front. And then I'm just going to add in little pieces around it to make sure that it's the right size. We're going to leave our front piece, the pentagram, here, and we're going to go and look at the back section if you're wanting to do that, and then the sides. And then after those are done, then we can move on to the actual quilting and construction of the garment. The back block is made up of Drunken's Path, so that's what I'm starting with. I'm doing the outside pieces first in this pink colour, and I will have 8 of those by the end. I'm using an acrylic template for mine, but I have included the templates for how to create these in the download pack. We're doing the inside of the Drunkard's Path, and this is what creates those semicircles and circles of the moon phases. Then you're creating 8 of these. We also need to cut out lots of strips, both in inch, 2 inch, and also little strips for in between the Drunkard's Paths or between the moon phases. I find it easier to cut everything out all at once, but I am breaking this up so that we can look at each part individually. And now I'm actually going to lay out my cut pieces of the moon phases so I can make sure that everything is the right size and distance apart. Once you add it in your Drunkard's Path, you'll see that they actually look like they're smaller or too small. They're not. That's just how the seam allowance works so that they fit together to make these semicircles and circles. I'm also going to lay out where I want to put my strips so that I can see how I want all of this to lay out in the end. Using a 1/4 seam allowance, sew these pieces together. Try not to stretch them out as you do. And then once they're sewn together, you need to true them up. So go back over them and cut them out so that they're a perfect square again. Try to keep those small little ends of the outer pink piece to about the same size so that you're actually cutting this square. Like I said before, Drunkard's Paths, because of where they lay on the bias of the fabric, they do stretch a lot. Between each moon section, I added 1 inch pieces of fabric so that I could just give them a little bit of space from each other so that they looked correct rather than all being squished up together. Now that my main block is done, I'm just going to keep experimenting and trying different strips of fabric to see what I like. All of them are either 2 inches wide or 1 inch wide. And every time I add new ones, I repress everything down again so that everything is smooth and straight and where it should be, particularly because sometimes those seams need to lie in different directions because of the colours of the fabric. Just like with our front piece, we need to keep checking and rechecking that we have enough fabric being made to completely cover or create our garment pieces. So I'm just going to keep adding pieces on, trying to keep that moon phases section right in the center of my back. For the side sections, I'm using lots and lots of scraps that I have from the rest of the project, and I'm going to be using a Dresden template. Again, this is part of the download that I have available as an add-on for the Skadi vest. If you don't have acrylic templates for these and you don't want to buy all of them, you can simply use the templates that I have available there. You just, again, cut around them. I'm doing 2 layers at a time for this. It's a little bit tricky on the curve at the top there, but I end up cutting most of those off, so it doesn't really matter. To make each of the side pieces, as I have done in the example, you need a total of 20 of these Dresden little pieces, patchworks, so that you can actually have enough for each of those 4 side panels. Once all your patchwork is cut out, we can start laying it out and seeing how we want this all to come together. And originally I was trying really hard to keep this all symmetrical and even, and then because I stopped thinking about it, it no longer is. So we'll say that that was a design choice, and then I didn't just mess it up. You also really need to think about how you're going to mirror those patchwork pieces, because these pieces are mirrored on either side. They're not exactly the same. Make sure that you give everything a good press between pieces, and then you may need to go back and add more and more as your seam allowances shrink down as you're adding pieces in, but that's okay. Because this is a quilted vest, make sure that all of your final pieces are larger than what you think you need, so that when you quilt them and they shrink again, you don't lose too much of your sizing. Now that I have enough patchwork fabric for each of my side pieces, I'm going to double check that they are the right size for my pattern pieces. And I'm also going to cut them a little bit, still too big, but cut them a smidge so that I remember which way around each of these pieces go in terms of the mirroring. So I'm adding in that curve at the top there so I know where the arm is, and I'm doing the same thing at the bottom just to make sure that I remember which piece goes where when I finally get back to actually constructing the garment after all of the quilting is done. Now that all of our patchwork is done, we can baste together, temporarily put together our wadding and our backing for our quilted pieces. This is the same process for all of the pieces. I personally prefer to use a basting spray, but you can choose to use pins, or you can hand baste this together with a basting thread. Totally up to you and your personal preference. I went into a lot more detail about this for view A, so if you want to see that video and how I baste layers together, you can see that using the link below in the description. For my little side pieces, I'm going to pre-rough cut out the backing before I bother with the wadding. This is mostly to make sure that the backing that I'm using is the right way around, the right way up, because it is a directional print. So when I reverse the vest, and the vest is reversible like all the others, then I will know that all of my pieces are the way that I want them to be. Once I've finished rough cutting out my backing, then I can actually do the same thing with the wadding. This just is easier to handle and manage as I'm putting everything through my sewing machine. I really don't want to have to deal with a big piece going through. It's a lot harder to quilt big pieces than little pieces. So I may as well use the little pieces that I have for this pattern, because it's a garment, to my advantage and make things easy on myself by just putting through little tiny quilts as I go through. I'm going to be stitching in the ditch for this one, so that in particular means that little pieces are a lot easier. To quilt these pieces together, we're going to stitch in the ditch, which means to follow the exact seam line of each of our patchwork pieces, or however many you want to follow. For our side seams, it looks like this. I'm going pretty slowly. For the main pieces, like the pentagram, and for the moon phases, this is a little bit tricky because we're actually going around circular things. To make things easier on myself, I'm going to be using a walking foot. You don't have to use a walking foot, but it is recommended so that all of your fabric comes through at the same speed. I'm going to start in the center of each of my pieces and work my way outwards, flattening them as I go. I'm starting with my beautiful pentagram, and then I'm working out to the circle and then to the strips. You can genuinely skip the round sections of each of these blocks. It won't make that big of a difference to your end piece, but if you want to go around them, make sure that you go slow and pivot a lot by lifting your presser foot. Now is the time that we're going to take our cutout pattern pieces and use them to cut out our actual fabric, our quilted pieced fabric. It's so exciting. This video is for view B specifically, so the bib front side closure view of the Skadi vest. So if you are wanting to make that, this is the one for you. I also have a video for view A if you want a front center closure. So make sure that when you're cutting out your pieces that you're remembering that they need to be, the front and the back panel need to be cut on the fold. So you need to have one side and the other side together. You will also have 4 side panels, 2 of each kind cut mirrored. So they need to be reflecting each other rather than exactly the same. It's these little things which can really make a difference when you're making a garment in terms of your frustration and it turning out the way you want it to. To cut my pieces out, I'm actually going to pre-mark them using some chalk. You can use the pattern templates if you'd like to, but as this is quite thick, fluffy, movie fabric because of the quilting, I find it a lot easier to just make sure that everything's right by marking it all out first, particularly marking out that center line for both the front and the back because they are so obviously a front and a back. I find it really helpful to just make sure that that is correct first. I'm going to use my pattern weights even for the marking up sections just to make sure that nothing moves because it is very likely to move and to try and move. If it does, it's fine. You can just simply true up those little sides and things that aren't quite right after you've sewn everything together if you notice that things weren't completely square, but it's better to try not to have anything askew. Once everything's marked up and you're sure everything's fine, you can cut everything out either using a rotary cutter like I am or using your scissors. Both are completely valid options. Don't worry about being exactly the same as me with this one, just whatever you have available and whatever you're comfortable with. So now we should have all of our pattern pieces cut out, ready to go, and we can actually start constructing the garment, which is very exciting. Because this is view B rather than view A, which again, you can see view A, just have a look at the links in the description. They are constructed quite differently. We're going to start by adding the side pieces to our front and our back panels. Once that's done, then we're going to do our shoulder seams. To attach the side pieces, you're going to start right underneath the underarm when those points meet up. And then you're slowly going to rotate that side panel around to meet up with the layer underneath your main piece, your main front or your main back. Neither pieces of fabric should stretch during this process. It's more about pivoting and matching them up. So I try really hard to make sure that my main big piece stays flat and that I'm just pivoting around my smaller piece as I go. Right now for the tutorial, I am clipping or pinning this side together so that you can see how to construct it, but I actually don't like doing that at the machine. I much prefer to not pin and be able to organically move that front little piece, that side section, around as I work it through the machine. You're going to follow these same steps for all 4 side panels so that you then only have 2 pieces ready to be sewn together, a front and a back. You're making sure that for all of those side panels that you're starting at those points right at the top underneath the arm where they attach to the very front or the very back. So I've now removed all of my pins and clips, and I'm going to rotate my little side pieces through on top of the fabric, on top of the main panel as I take it through the sewing machine. I'm going to try my best to show you how I do this on the machine, but it's not easy to film sewing on a machine to show detail and exactly how you're doing something as well as the overall picture, but I'm going to try my best. So I'm lining up that point at the underarm, and that's where I'm going to start. As you can see, nothing else is lined up, just that point. I'm going to put that underneath the machine, and I am going to be starting with a back stitch just to make sure everything's constructed as it should be. Then I'm going to sew down until the 2 pieces of fabric start to separate, so they're no longer lined up. Then I lift my presser foot and re-line up the side seams, sew a little bit more. Lift up the presser foot, adjust the bottom, adjust the top so that they're matching together, and sew again. And I'm just going to keep repeating that, lifting up my presser foot, moving mostly the top piece, not stretching anything, but just pivoting that top piece around as I move down the side seam. Now, when you saw it before and it was pinned, it didn't look like it was quite the right size, but actually now it is. So it just depends as you're making it, how that works. The only thing left to do now for the actual construction is to sew the shoulder seams together, line them up and just sew using the same stitch allowance that you have on everything else. And then everything's constructed, it's ready for all of the binding. As you can see, I've already added the binding to the side seams. I find it a lot easier to put that binding onto the side seams before everything's put together and you've got to wrangle this big garment. So if you want to do that and then come back to this step, that is totally valid and makes a lot of sense actually. So you can do that, or you can do all of the construction and then all of the binding in one go. It's totally up to you. We're now going to skip to the optional ties because this is view B and it's unlikely that you won't want some kind of closure on the side. We're going to do it now just to make sure that you don't forget. I recommend doing 2 sets of ties on each side of your Skadi vest, which means that you need a total of 8 ties. This is of course up to you. You can do more, you can do less. You can do Velcro closures on each side if you would prefer, or magnets or zips or a million other things. This is just the simplest one to make. If you do want to do Velcro tabs for something that is more accessible, then simply make each of these ties as long as you want your Velcro to be, so approximately between 5 and 10 centimeters, and use that instead on each side and then stitch Velcro over the top or hook and loop tape over the top of each of the ties so that you can have an adaptive option. First thing you need to do is cut out more 2.5-inch strips. You can use your binding, which is cut on the cross grain, or you can just use regular strips if you want to. Once all of your strips are cut out, you need to do a lot of pressing and folding and repressing. So you're going to start with your strips open, flat, and then you're going to press them in half lengthways. Once you've finished doing that, then you need to take each of the outer long edges and fold them in to meet the center, not past it, just to meet it. And you're going to press each of those again as well. Once you've finished doing that, and they're each pressed in to the center, you will have 3 fold lines when you open up your ties. You need to refold them all over again so that the outer edges are into the center, and then that's folded in half, and then you're going to press all of that again really well so that you create this lovely skinny strip of fabric with no raw edges showing at all. You need to cut each of your ties to approximately 35 centimeters, which is 13 inches. You don't have to be super accurate with this, but it's better to have more than not enough so that you can actually tie it. Once your ties are cut to the correct length, we need to go back to the ironing board. Open up one short end of your tie and then fold it 1 centimetre down or a little bit less. And then you're going to refold all of your previous long folds so that the very end of your tie, each of them, no longer has any raw seams on the outside. Make sure that you press this really well into place and then you're up to sewing your ties together. Simply sew along that short end that's been folded in and then pivot and sew down the long side with the double fold. This will hold everything in place so that it then becomes a tie. Grab your vest and we now need to work out exactly where to put our ties. You can simply do 1 set on each side, but I prefer to do 2. It's really important that you place them low enough away from the underarm and high enough away from the bottom hem that they don't get caught up in the wrong parts of your binding around the whole edge of your vest. So this is at least 1.5 centimetres on either edge. So just make sure you do that and everything will be fine. Once you've worked out where you want them to be, baste them into place and now you're ready to attach your binding. We are finally up to doing the binding. You need to cut strips on the bias or diagonal grain of your fabric. They need to be 2.5 inches wide. Some people do them a little bit narrower, but I think 2.5 is absolutely perfect. And you're going to cut out heaps, more than you even think that you need. Some of these we're going to stitch together to make continuous binding, and some of them are just going to be little strips to do the seam allowances. You're going to then press these in half lengthways so that they have a beautiful line down the center of them. Once you have all of this, heaps of it, you're going to start attaching one to the other to make this continuous binding for around the outside of your garment. You need to line them up on the diagonal, creating this little square, and then you're going to stitch diagonally across from your point to point. This will make it continuous and you'll have a lot less bulk. Once it's stitched from point to point, you'll have lots and lots and lots of it like this. Now all you need to do is trim back that little point back to 1/4 inch, and then you can simply repress those little parts into place with your iron. The first thing that we need to bind are the inner seams where the side and the main pieces are attached. You need to line up the raw edge of the binding with that seam allowance on the smaller side. Then using the 1/4 inch seam allowance that you have in your machine, you're simply going to stitch the binding down, trying to keep it butted up against that seam allowance on that side. As you're stitching, you need to keep readjusting and pivoting to make sure that you get all of your binding attached around the curves of the garment. You're really trying hard not to pull it into place. Just keep realigning it as you pivot around rather than stretching it. Do your best to keep all of your stitches clean and neat and as straight as you can, because this will be seen on the right side or outside of your vest. Once the raw edge of your binding has been attached, you can fold this over your seam allowance. You can trim your seam allowance if you need to, and then you simply need to top stitch this binding over the top of your seam allowance. From the inside, you will only see one line of stitching, but on the outside, you'll actually see 2 either side of your seam allowance there. Now that the binding is covering all of our internal seams, we can cut it off and true up all of our sides. Then repeat all of those steps for the shoulder seams, trim them back, and we're ready to bind the outside. And if you haven't actually tried on your vest yet, now you definitely should. Now grab your big roll of continuous binding that you made following the pattern instructions, and you're going to get it ready for both the neck binding and around all of the edges. We're just going to roughly cut it, making sure that we have an overlap at the start and end of our binding. The raw edge of your binding should match up with the raw edge on the outside of your vest. It is critical that you have an overlap and a gap at the very start and the end. Attach the binding to the vest using your sewing machine, 1/4 of an inch all the way around every single outside edge. When you get to the corner, you're going to stop and you're going to stitch out to the edge. Then you're going to fold the next side back up so that it's in line again with the raw side of your hem. I've got another video on this, which is for view A if you want to see it in more detail. So let's get the neck binding attached. For this, we're going to do an extra fold and turn it into bias binding instead of quilter's double binding. This will make it easier to get around the tight curves at the neck. The same basic steps as all of the other binding. You're going to leave a tail and a gap at the back of the neck, and you're just going to attach the raw edge, the unfolded raw edge, around the neck on the right side. It's really important when stitching this that you don't stretch out the binding. Move it around as you pivot rather than trying to stretch it around that neck. All of the binding is going to be closed up the same way, so skip forward if you want to see how to do that. To finish off the neck binding, simply flip your vest over and then roll that binding around to the underside of your vest. To finish off a continuous quilt binding in a seamless way, you're going to do the same thing basically that you did before when it wasn't attached, and that is to cross it over on the diagonal and stitch over it. We have this long tail so that we can overlap the ends by the same width as the binding itself. So in this case, that's 2.5 inches. So I'm going to mark that on both the bottom and on the top overlap of my binding. Then we need to trim our tails so that the overlap is exactly the same as the width of our binding. So I'm going to chop off my excess, and now they overlap by exactly 2.5 inches. Open out your ends and place them right sides together away from your vest on the diagonal. I'm then going to use some pins to show you where I'm going to stitch, but the same as when we created the continuous binding, it's just from point to point on the diagonal. It is tricky to get it through your machine. It's a lot of bulk, and you will need to sort of squish up your vest a little bit so that the diagonal of the binding can lay flat as it goes through your machine. Refold with the pins to make sure that it is the right size and that everything is going to fit together nicely before you actually stitch it. If you're a little nervous at this point, it is perfectly fine to do some basting stitches first that are really long that you can take out if they're wrong, or to sew straight over the top of if you realize that you did it perfectly. As this binding is cut on the bias, unlike traditional quilters binding, you will need to be careful of its stretching as you do this. Once you have finished sewing this, you simply need to snip off that excess so that it all matches together and you can't actually tell anymore where it begins and ends. Lay your binding down flat, and then you can take it back over to the sewing machine and finish sewing across that bottom edge of your binding. To finish your binding, simply roll it around to the other side of your vest to cover all of those raw edges. I prefer to hand stitch my binding down, but of course if you want to machine stitch it, go right ahead and machine stitch it. I have instructions for how to do that on view A's instruction video. Hand stitching your binding down is really simple and actually quite relaxing. You just need to do a series of small little whip stitches all the way around, making sure that you're keeping that binding taut around the edge of the vest.